Kyle Smith. I'm the Oregon field coordinator for Trout Unlimited. Today I'm going to be tying some steelhead flies. I've been tying flies for about 5 or 6 years now, and I really like tying on tube flies. I've got some Pro Nano tubes from Pro Sport Fisher today. I like tube flies because your line is a straight connection. You run your line through the tube and then tie your hook onto your line, and I find that you get less fouling. Fish have less leverage to work themselves off the hook on a tube. I like to fish pretty wide gap, short octopus hooks with these tube flies. We've got a little Pro Sport Fisher jig here, which is clamped into my vise. And we'll slide the tube back onto, it's kind of a mandrel, and pressure keeps that tube in place so it's not going to move around on me. And I've got some just ultra thread, 140, so pretty good strong black thread here. We'll just start that on the tube and go back to the junction. You'll see this has got a little kind of nipple on the back of it where we're going to start tying. And when the fly is finished, I'll actually insert a little hook keeper. It's a little rubber hook keeper onto the back there. And your hook, when you're tied on, slides into the hook keeper and keeps it from fouling on any material that you might have hanging off the back of the fly. I've got some polar chenille from Hairline Dubbin. This is nice, flashy stuff. It's got some kind of iridescent material, iridescent fibers in it. I like that for steelhead to kind of catch their attention. We'll start that in the back. And this fly, I don't really tie steelhead patterns per se. I just kind of like to make up a lot of steelhead flies as I go and kind of improvise. This one is loosely based on a pattern that a guide friend of mine showed me called a samurai. So we'll do 2 or 3 wraps of, maybe 4 wraps of polar chenille here on the back, and tie that off. A couple of wraps to lock it down. I've got some rabbit strips here somewhere from Hairline Dubbin, just purple rabbit strips. But what I'm looking for is just a nice even section where all the fibers are coming off of the hide in a uniform direction. And I'm going to cut off, let's say, about 2 or 3 inches, just kind of depending on the mood. Obviously, a longer section of bunny rabbit is going to give you a bigger profile. So I like to fish longer, bigger flies in murkier, cloudier water and kind of keep my flies a little bit smaller when the water conditions are low and clear. So we'll just place this bunny rabbit strip right on the top of the fly and give it a couple of wraps. I like to use a pretty strong thread when I'm tying with bunny rabbit because you really got to get in there and kind of cinch that down pretty well. It's a big piece of material and it'll pull out if you don't give it a good solid wrap. Put a dab of epoxy or whatever kind of glue you're using. I really like just basic Loctite super glue. Do just a little dab of that. Oop, that's probably too much. Clear some of that out of there. And I like to apply super glue as I go, kind of throughout the tying process, just to keep everything secure because I don't want this fly falling apart. I like, I'll fish one fly for a couple weeks on end. So I really want the fly to stay together and not fall apart. This is going to be a pretty heavy fly. I like to fish these flies in coastal waters where you're really trying to get down in a hurry. So I'll flip the whole fly upside down on my rotary vise here, and I'm going to put a lead eye on the bottom of the fly. And this lead eye helps as a rudder. It kind of keeps the fly situated in the water, keeps it from riding funny. So I'll start this out here with just about 10 or 15 wraps in one direction, and then kind of use my fingers to pry it back to perpendicular with the tube and do another 10 or 15 wraps. And then we do some figure 8s. And we'll throw another little bit of super glue. So some super glue just to lock those threads in. Let's see, we've got some black marabou. I'm looking for a nice thin quill up towards the tip. And I like my barbules on the feather to be pretty wispy and kind of pointy. So I'll strip back the base part of the quill there and grab the very tip of the feather and pull those fibers back so that you've just got a little tie-in point. Tie that feather in. We're going to trim off that front piece that we tied in on. Then use some hackle pliers. Grab that quill. You're going to pull all the fibers out of the way of the fly, kind of get them all facing back the same direction. All right, then we're just going to palmer that marabou on there using the rotary function on the vise. All right, we'll go ahead and lock that down. Trim that quill off. Great, so you can kind of see the shape of the fly coming together there. And I like it if some of those fibers are a little bit errant and kind of want to slide forward on that marabou. That'll give it a nice full profile as it's swimming through the water. So this is a rhea feather. You can see I've pretty well used it up here. But we're just going to trim off a section of this rhea feather right at the base of the quill. And I've got maybe 10 or 12 pieces of rhea there. I like to clump my materials in this fashion rather than going to the trouble of putting them in a dubbing loop. So a nice loose wrap there 1 or 2 times. And then I like to use my scissors or my finger to just get in there and spread the material around the shank of the tube. Since we've got that bunny strip on top, I just want to give something to the bottom of the fly to give it a little bit of interest and some more movement. So give that a couple of wraps in there and then trim off all that excess. Flip the fly back around. All right, we're gonna do one more wrap of marabou. Find a good one there, and just again peel off the back of the feather to give your hackle pliers something to purchase onto, to hold onto kind of. I really like to go pretty sparse with my marabou. I find that if you overdo it with marabou, the fly just kind of holds a lot of water and gets heavy when you don't need it to be heavy. So keep it sparse. Less is always better, I think, when tying steelhead flies. Give that a couple of wraps just to hold it in place and trim off that front section. Last time I used the rotary. You don't have to use the rotary, and I'm not going to use it this time. We're just going to wrap it around the tube the old-fashioned way. And I'm really trying to get to the front of where I tied those eyes in this time, just to fill up that space on the shank of the tube. Lock that down in there. Fibers you just want to get in there with your fingers or maybe with a pair of scissors and pull those out so everything's free and moving around on its own. We're going to finish things off with some strung guinea. This is a great fly, or a great feather for tying flies, just because it's got these polka dots on it, kind of. It gives you good contrast on your fly. We were going to strip off the back bit of the fly, pick out about maybe an inch of the material that you're going to actually wrap around the hook. Leave a little bit in the front so that you can tie it in. Lock that in there real good. Trim on there, and again, you're just going to kind of fold the fibers back so they're all not flying in an errant direction, and wrap around right up to the lead eyes on the hook there, or on the tube rather. Lock that in real good. Trim her off. Mechanical whip finisher like one of these guys won't actually work. It just won't fit around all that extra material. So I've kind of come to whip finish with my fingers. Tying your thread together and tying it down on the hook so that it doesn't come unraveled. All right. Tie that off, and then I like to give everything kind of a nice pull, pretty brisk pull forward to stand all those materials up real good. Kind of pick it out with your fingers, or if you've got a toothbrush, it works pretty good. Brush it forward. Really trying to be pretty harsh on the materials just to get everything standing up together. And then just give it a nice little, finish it off with a little super glue. Cut the front of that tube off, expose that nipple. One of your hook keepers just slides right on there. There it is. So you've got your hook keeper back there. You'll just slide that onto your line, tie your hook on, and then pull the hook back up, and that knot will sit down right in that hook guide. You'll be fishing. So I'm Kyle Smith. I'm the Oregon Field Coordinator for Trout Unlimited. Trout Unlimited is the nation's largest cold water fisheries conservation organization. We're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We have about 300,000 members and friends across the country. Those members are organized into local chapters. So here in Oregon, we have 7 TU chapters, and then the state council, which oversees kind of our advocacy efforts. Those are all the volunteer side of the organization, and I'm paid staff for TU, so we've got about 15 paid staff members in state. And we work on everything from taking out the Klamath dams down in southern Oregon coming up in 2020, putting large woody debris and fish habitat in local rivers, and I personally work on protection campaigns for public lands. So working on the Elk River down in southern Oregon, trying to get protection for the south side of Elk River, and then also working to protect rivers in the Kalmiopsis region in southwest Oregon, which is a steelhead and salmon stronghold, and we're lucky to have a 20-year mineral withdrawal down there that occurred last year. But that mineral withdrawal is now under threat, and so those salmon and steelhead rivers are facing kind of an uncertain future. So we're working to shore up those protections and make sure that my kids' kids get to go salmon and steelhead fishing when they're adults. So to that end, we're going to tie kind of a loose interpretation of a Steelhead Intruder fly today. Tube, so you just slide that tube right back onto this tapered part of the jig so that it doesn't go anywhere. Got some 140 ultra thread here. Nice strong thick thread because we're really going to be clamping down on our materials. This has got a little nipple on the back. When we're done tying the fly, we're going to put a little hook keeper on there. And when you're rigging your tube fly to fish, you'll actually run your fishing line through the tube, tie your hook onto your line, and then pull that hook back up into the hook keeper here on the end of the fly. And I like that because the direct connection from your line to a nice short hook, the fish doesn't have nearly as much leverage to kind of wiggle itself off that hook when you're fighting a nice big chrome steelhead. I've got a little bit of flashy chenille here. Steelhead aren't feeding when they're in the river. When they come back into fresh water, they're largely just here to spawn and then to try and make it back out to the ocean. So when they do attack a fly, it's mostly because they're in a predatory response. So you're trying to put something in their face that'll kind of make them upset or trigger that predatory response. And I have a friend that a lot that used to say, steelhead will eat anything that looks like it's something that Barbie would wear. So lots of pinks and purples and lots of feathers and kind of flashy looking stuff like this. So we're going to do a couple of wraps of this chenille here next. So I really want to have a nice kind of high ball of chenille on the back of this fly so that when we go to tie in your next layer of materials, it helps prop it up and create that nice big profile in the water so that it's easier for steelhead to see. If the water might be off color, it's kind of muddy out. So that's chenille, and then we've got a Lady Amherst cape here. We want the back profile of this fly to be smaller, and it's going to get bigger in the front. Pull that out of the cape, and you can see the top of the feather has a nice thin quill, but down towards the bottom it's pretty thick, and that would be really hard to wrap around the hook. So we're going to pull the barbules off and then grab onto the top of the quill and just pull some of those barbules back so that they stick out, and you've got a nice little, you're left with a nice tag to tie your fly onto, or tie into the fly. Tie that in there. Trim off the front. Got some hackle pliers to grab onto the back of that quill. And you're just going to try and wrap that right in front of that ball of chenille that you created when you first started the fly. So I ended up with about 2 wraps of that Lady Amherst in there, and you can see how that sticks up really good. Think of that trying to ride through the water. It's going to maintain that profile and stick out and give you kind of some visual interest there. I'm going to take some French mini flat braid from Lagerton. We're going to cut off about 1 foot of that, maybe a little less than 1 foot, and tie that in. I like to tie it in about 1 inch up the length of the tube just to kind of make sure it's really well seated in there, and then go ahead and tie back. And what I'm looking for here is to get wraps right in front of that Lady Amherst so that the braid starts right in front of that Lady Amherst. Then we'll take our thread back up to the front of the tube. And we're basically wrapping a body.
That's what I'm doing continuously.
So using the rotary feature of the vise here makes it real easy to just keep that wrapping right on top of itself all the way up. We're going to do about 1.5 inches up the fly. So get a good wrap there and tie off that braid, cut off the extra. So now you've got the body of your fly pretty well defined. Ed Ward kind of is the guy that developed the Intruder fly back in the mid to late 90s. He was looking for a fly that moved, had a really big profile in the water, but didn't have a lot of mass. This is an Arctic foxtail here. I'm going to take a good amount of that. Take what you think you need and cut it in half. That's a good rule for tying steelhead flies. So I cut off, about the size of a generous pencil lead. We're going to pull those guard hairs out, the really long ones that kind of stick out more than the rest of the fur does. And then you'll switch your hand position and kind of comb out the under fur too. There's some other fibers that are shorter than the rest of it. And what you're looking for is just kind of a uniform length of tail fibers there. For some folks, will put this in a dubbing loop and wrap it around the hook, but that takes a lot of time. So I like to tie my Arctic fox in reverse. So we're actually going to tie the fibers going forward, then we're going to come back and stand them up and put some thread wraps around the front to give it that nice vertical profile. You really want the front of the fly to stick up. So one real loose wrap. As far as we're going to end up cutting off this back section of the Arctic fox, the length of this front section to come back and just kind of meet up with the tail end of these fibers here. And what I really want to have happen is for that Arctic fox to kind of spread all the way around the hook. I want those fibers to spin around the hook with the thread. So we'll lock that in there. Great. So then we'll come around the front and just give it a couple of thread wraps right at that junction where you tied in the fibers to try and stand it up a little bit, but not so much that you're tying it down and locking it back in the other direction. So you can see how that sticks up and it's kind of crazy. And that's going to help tent up your the rest of the materials you're going to tie on for the rest of the fly here. So I'm going to go back to my Lady Amherst cape here and take a longer feather. You can see again real thick quill there, and start peeling back those fibers over the thick part of the quill. I'm going to cut off a little bit of that quill because it was a little too thick. So I'll grab this by the tip, peel back some of those fibers to get down to the quill at a good place to tie it in. We're going to tie this in right in front of that Arctic fox there. This is going to be a little tricky because the Arctic fox is in the way. So get in there with your fingers. If you don't, this would be a great spot, like I said, to tie that all back with a pipe cleaner. But if you don't, you just got to use your fingers to keep pulling it back. All right. Once you get back to the bare part of the quill that you've stripped, tie it in and cut it off. Just make sure I'm constantly, as I'm tying a fly, I'm going through and making sure all the fibers are standing up on their own. Nothing is getting looped under other fibers or like tied down in a way that I don't want it to. So just kind of checking your progress as you go will make your finished product look a lot better. Great. We're going to end today here with a wrap of marabou on the front of this fly to give it a nice full profile. Looking for a nice thin quilled marabou feather. We're going to strip off the back little bit of it. Again, looking for that quill and grabbing the front part of the feather and just looking for a nice amount of fiber that's going to stick out for you. And then smoothing the front part forward and using that as your tie-in point. Trim off that front portion. So I'd say that's the funnest part about tying steelhead flies. You know, trout flies are pretty prescripted. You really are following a recipe. You're trying to make it look like an insect. With steelhead flies, kind of anything goes. And so I clumsily managed to get that marabou feather on there. Finish trimming off the quill. Or pro sport fisher have a wide variety of kind of accessory products you can go. And then I really like these cone heads. This is called an ultrasonic disc. And I think that the hydraulics of these heads I'm really impressed with. The water just seems to go through there and give the fly more life than just a regular cone or a fly without something on the front of it. We've got plenty of clearance here, so I'm just going to use my whip finish tool to tie that off. Give that a dab in there. That'll help to lock the cone head on. We're also going to trim this plastic, and then we're going to use a lighter to burn that plastic back over the cone to really keep this cone in place where we want it. So we'll get that in there, and I like to use the cone to kind of push over the threads there. Cut that off. The excess, you want to leave about 1/8 of an inch there. Take this fly off the jig and use the blue part of the lighter to just kind of burn that cone back over the top.
I see thy bright shores in the sunlight, the heather of hills and the rising of morn, the rolling gracie mist grows east in the morning to run the wild hills of